Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Meet the Flipper Feet Pinnipeds of the Arctic Part 2, presented by Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. Thank you so much for being here today, Kristina. I'm going to turn it right over to you.
What? Oh, am I muted? Should be good now. So yeah, last week we covered Pinnipeds Part 1, and we're returning to sort of finish our story. So yes, I've been expedition leader with NatHab for 3 years, and I focus in on the Arctic. So we're going to focus in on some of the Arctic species. And just to sort of cover a little bit, if you weren't here last week, we talked about some cool adaptations that you can find in the Pinnipeds. Globally, everything from the really high fat content, both in their blubber as well as their milk when they produce, cool things like their whiskers. Their whiskers are very, very fine-tuned. The adaptations they have as mammals to be able to dive so deep, right? They need to have higher amounts of hemoglobin in their blood, their ability to constrict their blood vessels and keep all their blood in their organs, extremely, extremely well adapted to having an amphibious life. So now we've sort of generally talked about them last week, and now this week we're going to hone in on a few different key species. So there's about 38 species in the Pinniped family, and we are going to hone in on 5 of them. And of course, those 5 are a bit of a bias for 2 reasons. One, because I'm a polar bear guide, and I am very guilty of looking at the world through what a polar bear needs and what a polar bear interacts with. So there's actually about 7 species in the Arctic. There's also a ribbon seal and a hooded seal that we're not going to cover today, and they do have some very, very cool adaptations of their own. So if you go down the seal tunnel of fun facts, definitely give them a look. But today we're going to look at the ring seal, the bearded seal, the harp seal, the harbor seal, as well as the walrus. And so when we look at this graph here, I know graphs can sometimes seem like a lot of numbers and a lot of things, but really what we're trying to look at here is where these polar bears are living, their diet, right? So you can see that diet varies depending on where they are. But there's something that I think is kind of worth remembering when we think about seals and walruses as they fit into the whole ecosystem, right? So it's not just location, right? So what decides a polar bear's diet is specialization is hunting, age gaps, right? So as when they're younger, they're not going to be large enough to take on a walrus, let's say, but like a full-grown male would be something that would hunt a walrus, whereas a juvenile wouldn't even try. They would just focus on smaller ring seals. And so we're going to zoom out of that ecosystem perspective, right? So we started with the polar bears and what they're eating, but I want to take a bigger step back to really put into context Arctic pinnipeds. So what I'm showing you here is global biological production, so primary production. So that's your algae, your chlorophyll production, producing those sugars and kicking off the food chain, right? Kicking off the food web. So we're going to ignore land for a minute, right? We're just going to look at the ocean. And so that quite, I would say, neon, maybe painfully bright green, right? The highly productive regions of our world are the north and the south. And that's for a few reasons, right? So when you think about our poles, they have long periods of nighttime, right? So in the wintertime, they're not getting, or let's just talk about Northern Hemisphere for now. So in the Northern Hemisphere, our winters have very little light, but in the summertime, they have almost continuous light. But the other reason why these regions are so highly productive is because of upwelling. So essentially you have all these nutrients in the ocean and they go low, they go very, very deep along the bottom, and those nutrients get brought up to the surface at our poles, which means that there's a huge amount of nutrients available. And so that's why these are such biological hotspots. It's why migratory birds, for example, travel thousands of kilometers to reach those destinations rather than staying where they are, because the abundance of food is that surreal. And so to mirror this, we can see the same thing in the distribution of pinnipeds. So there are species all across the world, but the highest amount of them, the greatest density, are in those highly productive regions. And so we always think about, you know, if we're going to go on vacation, we want to go somewhere warm, you know, you want to go sleep on an island, but if you're a marine mammal, you want to be in those cold places. It's great. It's great for food. There's like ample habitat, right? And so there's a lot more migration going on up there in between places than we ever knew before. And so it's a cool thing to get to look at. So we've had a chance to sort of see the bigger scale now and place in context these species I'm about to go through. So let's kick off the very first one, which is the ringed seal. Now, the ringed seal is one of the best divers. It competes with some of the cetaceans as far as dive time. So a ringed seal can go under for 45 minutes, and it can dive approximately 45 meters. So to put that into perspective, let's take a look at our statue over here, right? So a blue whale, or if we look at the Statue of Liberty, they're able to dive the same depth as the Statue of Liberty underwater and hold their breath for 45 minutes if they need to, which to me is mind-blowing. I'm pretty sure I can hold my breath maybe max a minute 15 if I really practice and push. That's one of my goals, is to get better at that. And they weigh, depending on full maturity and then some difference between sexes, usually around 150 pounds, give or take a bit. And they have a very long lifespan. So they can live 25, 30 years in the wild, pretty normal. And lengthwise, they're about 4.5 feet. So think about your own body, right? So comparatively, they're the size of a teenager, give or take. I think that's the comparison I would make as far as the ringed seal. Now, they're called the ringed seal. I would call these more splotches than rings, but this is where they get the name from. And yeah, they live generally on continental shelves. So what they need to have is, they can't have the ice too thick, right? So they need to be somewhere where the ice isn't too thick for them to be able to get a breathing hole, and they need to be close enough, right? Because I'm saying that they dive, if they're diving around 45 meters, they're definitely not going to live somewhere where it's a deeper dive to get to the bottom. And that's a balance of two things, right? It's a balance of that food source I was talking about with all that biological productivity. So they need to be able to access their food source. And so they usually live somewhere where the ocean is less than 200 meters deep. And where they're living, there's an interesting bias, because so the mature hunting adults, they will get the primary, like the best hunting grounds, and the juveniles are often forced to the fringes. And then once then they can compete for better grounds, then they'll occupy those regions. And so I mentioned them needing to be able to breathe, right? And so they have to maintain a breathing hole. Now, some places the ice naturally opens and cracks, and so they can follow those, but sometimes it does freeze over, even just a thinner layer, right? And they will claw their way through that in order to secure a breathing hole. And they've been known to claw through more than 2 meters of ice. Now, that's not their preference by any means, but they're capable of that. So think about that for a second. If they're only about 1.5 meters long, so they're about 4 feet long, they can claw through more than 6 feet of ice, which is more than their own body length. That is a very solid commitment to being able to breathe. And just a quick aside, I really love this photo because it brings me back, it really sort of centers me in remembering that these are marine mammals and that these were once land animals. Looking at that claw, right, like to me, at the first look, if you hadn't told me that that was a seal, I would be trying to guess what type of bear that was. And I would have been like, well, that's the strangest looking thing I've seen. Because we often see them, we just see the cute smiley faces and the very slick streamlined bodies, and so they do seem very aquatic, but this I think really brings back their terrestrial roots. And so we've talked about they need to be close to their food source, but what is their actual food sources? So ring seals are exceptionally diverse. They will eat like a good, they're, what's the right way to say this? Where they can, they will specialize and really focus on one species, but they're also equally happy to be generalists. So it just sort of just depends on the region that they live in, but they'll eat anything from polar cod, which is what you're seeing in the top left. Those strange little white fish are called snail fish, which I think are very cool, more of a bottom feeder. They will eat cephalopods like octopus and squid, halibut. They'll even eat little amphipods. So that bottom right that you're seeing, those are very small crustaceans. The scale on that would be, you know, they would rarely get more than an inch in size, and they'll eat those too, right? And so their diet is very dependent on their region, what their access is, as well as their age, right? So think about you and I, right? When we were teenagers, we would eat a bunch of junk food probably if no one was watching what we ate. And then you get old and you're like, nah, maybe I'll focus on the stuff that's good for me. So the same sort of effort ratio happens here, where, you know, as they get older, they'll make the trek to the grocery store. They'll swim and bother to pick the high quality foods. And of course, it's worth remembering that they are also food for someone else further up the chain. Now, this is, I think it's worth noting, I think about this, thinking about that comparison, that the ring seal is roughly the same size as an adult human or a small human, is that, so they weigh about 150, 200 pounds, and a polar bear is able to pick them up and toss them without much pause or hesitation, which I always find quite intimidating. The other thing is that the polar bears are able to strip a seal of its blubber, completely eat it in less than an hour. They essentially gorge very, very quickly. And so there's a couple of things about this. One, it's because of competition, right? If they've just made a kill or a hunt, they definitely don't want to be losing that after putting all the effort into the hunt. But then the second part, which I think is really important to remember, is the conservation of energy. They're in the Arctic. It is anywhere from -20 to -40 degrees Celsius. It's freezing. Literally, if you spit, it'll freeze before it hits the ground. And so the moment the seal is killed, it instantly starts losing body heat because it's not producing its own. So the faster the polar bear can eat the seal, it's less energy it has to spend heating up its meal, right? It's way more efficient to digest it quickly as possible, which I think is sort of fascinating. And a quick aside, because I mentioned the -30. So I feel like everyone, or many people, have seen the hot water example where it's very, very cold and you throw the pot of boiling water in the air and it instantly turns into snow. But I would be very curious if anyone has ever seen the frozen bubble trick. I did this a few years ago. I guess it was a few years ago now, when I was living in the Yukon dog sledding, and it was so cold that I could blow bubbles and then they would stay, which was quite the experience. So it's, depending on where you're coming from, you might be used to some cold climates. Maybe this winter you might want to give this a try. And if you're not coming from somewhere cold, it's a good appreciation if you ever have the opportunity to go visit somewhere cold rather than to travel somewhere tropical. All right, back to our seals. So they'll live between, or sorry, not live. We know that they'll live to be 25, 30 years old, but the females become sexually mature around 5-ish, 4 to 6 years. And they're gonna have their pups generally that March, April period. So let's think about those poles again, right? So you have near complete darkness, or true darkness, if you're way up north. And then as spring hits, so think about it as a domino effect. The light comes, the phytoplankton kick off, the zooplankton kicked off, the small fish and invertebrates that eat them, and then so there's a whole trickle down effect. So it makes sense for them to have their pups in March and April when there's the most amount of food available. Now those pups will nurse for about 40 days, give or take, and they will actually gain about a pound a day, which I think is pretty darn cool as far as their ability to put on mass. Now when they're born, they have that very soft white fur. The lanugo is what it's called, and they have a nickname which I think is very cute. They're called silver jars at that stage. They'll have the same patterning as an adult, but it won't be necessarily quite as prominent yet. They won't have those rings show up. And once they're weaned, then the female will then go and mate. And so they again have that, I mentioned it last week if you were around, delayed implantation. So what that means is that they'll mate with the male, but the embryo won't implant into the uterine wall. And so there actually is a delayed processing. So they'll go about 90 days before they actually go to term and begin true pregnancy. Yes. So the birth layer is super cool. So once they are pregnant, so they'll carry that to term. And so I think this is most comparable for those from North America and from other places, right? When you think about a beaver hut, it's sort of that same kind of concept, right? So they'll dig a hole into the ice underneath. They'll often go places where there's ridges. So it's not like they had to pile up the snow, right? So what you would have is you'd have all these ice plates and they'd be pushing together and they'd hit back and forth. And so the ice would naturally sort of build up these ridges. And so they would go and find a ridge where there's already sort of a natural crack potentially, and then expand the hole and then make that with enough room for their pups. Now, the interesting thing is that the initial white fur that those pups have is actually heat-wise so efficient. It's such a good insulator that they don't really, they can survive out in the open. And so researchers have spent a lot of time thinking about this, that they probably have these birth layers more to prevent predation than necessarily to conserve heat. So thinking about that, right, if you were a pup and you're hidden underneath this layer, then your predator, whether that's a polar bear, a seabird, an Arctic fox, they have to dig through or crash the layer in order to get to you. So it gives them time to get into the water and swim away. Now, that being said, so there's the predation side of this, but there is still a heat component as far as efficiency. So this is pretty impressive as how insulating these can be. And so the lower critical temperature for a pup, which is a fancy way of saying when the pups are so cold they start to shiver. You and I have a lower critical temperature too, right? So usually when we say shivering, that's a physical expression of when our body has to put extra effort into staying warm. Really, our natural processes are always giving off heat and we're moving and there's enough heat produced, right? But you know, when you get cold and you're like, oh, I need to put on a sweater, you have that feeling of like, I need to produce, I need to contain more heat. That sort of moment, your sensation, we call that our lower critical temperature. So when they're pups and they have that really dense, really great white fur, their lower critical temperature is pretty good. Like they can keep it up until I think minus 25, which is sort of crazy because that's really what the Arctic temperature is. But once they're wet, right? So once their fur is wet, so if they have to jump in and swim or follow mom for some reason, then the lower critical temperature is 0 because they don't have that air insulating them anymore. And then they need to get up into the layer, they need to dry off, and they need to warm up because they're losing way too much energy to keep them warm. Which I think is pretty amazing. So we've learned a little about their life cycle. So now where are they living, right? So there are approximately 2 million ring seals that live in the Arctic. And there's a cool aside that I think is worth thinking about. So we often talk about biodiversity. When we say that, the initial thing that jumps to mind, at least for myself, is the number of species. And we think about the more number of species, the more diverse it is, right? Which is true. But there's a different way that you can also look at that. So there is not nearly as many types of animals living in the Arctic than, say, if you were to go to the tropics. There's way more different types of species living in the tropics than in the Arctic, right? But in the Arctic, there are fewer species, but there are a lot more of them. So think about this. There's 2 million ring seals. And so we, depending on who you talk to, people will sort of argue that there's about 5 or 6 subpopulations of those that essentially sort of keep to themselves and don't intermix. And so if you're at the tropics, you have a lot of species, but there's only a few of each kind. And so there's some genetic diversity with each of them. And then if in the reverse, in the Arctic, you have a lot of them of one kind, but then there's a lot of diversity within that species. And so as far as adaptability wise, it's actually a benefit to be a larger number and have more diverse within your chain, right? Because it means that the likely propagation under environmental changes has a biological advantage, let's say, which sort of makes sense because they live in such an unpredictable environment already that they have to be able to continually keep changing to match the world around them. So that wraps up ring seals, and it brings us to the bearded seal. So the bearded seal is not quite as high a population. There's about 500,000 of them spread throughout the Arctic. They're the largest of the Phocae, so one type, the true earless seal. They're the largest of that Arctic species, or largest of those species live in the Arctic. Either way. So they can grow about 2.5 meters long, and they'll weigh quite a bit. So you can get up to like 300, 400 kilograms. So we're talking, you know, over 1,000 pounds for one of these big beasties. And they're interesting. So unlike the ring seal, you know, who had that white, beautiful coat as a pup, they actually shed their first coat, while they're in the womb. So they molt inside the womb, and when they're born, they're already born with their second coat, which I think is pretty fascinating. And the pups are born weighing around 30 odd kilograms. So think about that as 60 to 80 pounds, depending on their birth weight. And the balance of this is that, so they're born, because they're born with already their second coat, they're actually born with a thicker layer of blubber than other seals. It's the trade-off, right? So the other seals have the higher amount of fur, but they're born with very little of their own fat content, and they have to nurse to build their fat content. Whereas the bearded seal is born with a greater fat content, and their fur is less efficient as an insulator. So it's a trade-off on the balance there as far as efficiency goes. And a cute aside, well, one, their nickname in Inuktitut, so in the Inuit language, is square flipper, because they have a very paddle-like flipper, which I think is pretty cute. And another difference of them between other Arctic seals is that they have 4 mammary glands, while many of the others only have 2. And it's sort of you can see it, it's one of the things that we use to break out their evolutionary links of figuring out which ones are more closely related to. So they also will maintain their own breathing holes as needed, but they prefer to live, if they can, where there's natural openings. So we call those polynyas. So essentially it's where the ice is naturally cracked and kept a flow open, or a large open area, and then they can kind of go back and forth between that and wherever their hunting ground is. And yeah, so they are not super deep divers. They actually kind of max out around 100 meters, and they prefer to feed in the shallows, right? They like those species that are in along the bottom. And so you can sort of see an efficiency range. So when they're younger, they'll dive much deeper looking for food, and as they get older, again, they're getting better at hunting, and so they don't ever necessarily go as deep. So, and then for their dive times, it's around 10 minutes, but they can hold their breath for 20-25 minutes if they needed to. So when I say benthic species, I'm thinking things that they're eating. So they're looking for, they'll go for crabs, squid, krill, mollusks, clams, things like that, which they'll find along the bottom and sort of use those cool whiskers to feel out that I pointed to before. And of course, again, the only predator to the bearded seal is the polar bear. It's one of the big reasons why you'll never see a bearded seal. They don't like to haul out on land further than their body length away from the water. They really, or on ice, excuse me, they want to stay as close as possible to the water as they can. They feel much more secure that way. And yeah, so they're gonna pup, their time for having their pups is gonna be, again, that like March sort of May period. And their puppies are so cute. They get this sort of banded look on their face, like a robber or a raccoon kind of. And because they're born they're born essentially able to swim within an hour, which is quite impressive. And again, that's a predation tactic, right? So their time on land is a very vulnerable time, especially because they've all synced up to give birth at the same time. So a polar bear hunting, if they find an area where they are having their pups, they need to have the pup and get into the water as soon as possible. So they've traded off on that predation versus stability and conserving heat, right? And again, that's part of that evolution, to have their blubber rather than their fur. You always have to trade off on where they make their investments. And so they will stay with their mom before they're weaned for about 18, 20 odd days, give or take a bit. And these ones, so they can gain, let's see, 3.5 kilograms. So we're looking at 8 to 10 on a lucky day pounds in a single day. So they're putting on so much fat so quickly, right? Because right, mother's milk, that's looking, the fat content of a bearded seal is somewhere around 50%. So they're just consuming so much fat, trying to layer up and really conserve that heat. I'm going to give something a try here that I haven't done before, so bear with me. One of the other very cool things about bearded seals is their song. And so they have a trill, but then they have another sound going with it. And so I took a marine mammals class a long time ago now, I guess we're looking at like 7 or 8 years, and we had to memorize all the different songs that they had. And it's sort of fascinating because they can make 2 sounds at once. They can have a long trill and then also almost like a follow-through note. They're like their own orchestra. And so I'm going to play this into my mic. I'm going to give a forewarning. It's a very high-pitched sound. So if you're listening with headphones or maybe sensitivity to high lows, maybe just turn it down a little bit and then turn it up as you hear it. But I don't want to startle anyone. So I'm just going to pop this off here and see if we can play the sounds. So you can hear that initial trill, and then you can hear the in the background. And so males are really cool. This is part of their mating display, is these calls to attract females. And with that call, they'll actually do bubble displays under the water, and they'll have a territory that they're protecting, and they'll have these songs and bubbles. And so the songs are to draw the females in, and then they'll have these bubble displays once they've attracted them. And they'll sing their songs for weeks trying to attract a female, which I think is very cool. There's a very eerie sound. I often wonder if that's where, a lot of our sci-fi sounds, I feel like Star Wars and Star Trek took a lot of their lightsaber sounds from the seals. It's one of my long-standing running theories. Oops. And of course, we need to talk about why they're called the bearded seal. It's because they have a fantastic mustache. And you will have to forgive me, but the best mustache in the world still belongs to Tom Selleck. I am guilty of my mom being a Tom Selleck fan. And so as a kid, my dad would have us watch Westerns, and my dad wanted to watch for the Westerns, and my mom wanted to watch them because Tom Selleck was in some of them. So yes, a very fantastic mustache. And while Tom Selleck's, I think, is probably the most daring, I would say that the bearded seal mustache probably has much more tactile use. And that's because each one of those whiskers has 1,300 nerve cells attached to it. So they're using their whiskers when they're feeding along the bottom to feel out any of their small prey items and then instantly be able to find them very quickly. And so it gives me much more great respect for a very good mustache. All right, leaving the bearded seal and its mustache behind, we're going to move on to the harp seal. So there are around 7 million harp seals, and those extend from the Arctic down along the Atlantic coast of Canada and a little bit into the northern US coast in there as well. These ones are around 5.5, 6 feet in length, and they'll weigh, maxing out close to 300 pounds. So a bit bigger than the ring seal, smaller than the bearded seal, sort of that medium size. And their harp name comes from their pattern on their back, sort of a hazy oval there, which they used to indicate with the harp, or implicate with the harp. And yeah, so diving wise, they're pretty impressive. They can go 370 meters, and they can go down for about 15 minutes. So it's really, really quite impressive. I always wish I was more marine. And they have, all seals have this, but focusing on these ones, so they have counter current blood exchange on their flippers. So what that means is that when you think about diving that deep, right, it's cold, right? You're in the Arctic, you're losing these things. And so they really need to be as efficient as possible with their oxygen, with their heat conservation. And so the blood that goes out into the flippers, right, it's going to get cold much quicker because their flippers are so thin compared to the middle of their body. And so their vascular system, their veins, are set up so that the hot blood flows right beside the cool blood, and they exchange the heat so that you don't get that cold shock to your system before it comes back in. And another very cool thing is that seals lack tear ducts. So they don't have that to drain away their eyes. So it's why they have that very glossy, very adorable finish that we are all so familiar with. And they have huge spherical lenses. So something to think about it as an amphibious creature is that they have to be able to see in water and on land. And that takes quite a bit of an adaptation, because think about the changes, right? In the water, it's extremely dark, light is limiting, whereas when they're coming to the surface, you have that immensely bright white snow. And so for that night adaptation, they have the same thing that cats have, right? It's the, this word is always so hard, tapetum lucidum. And it's that reflective picture, pigments that are able to bring in as much light as possible. And we are pretty sure that they have a certain range of color vision, but they haven't been able to identify exactly what that is. But we do know then their eyes are adapted to be able to withstand that high amount of ultraviolet light, right? Because you have the sun coming down on you, but then they also have it reflecting off the snow, so they really have to worry about snow blindness. So an example, right? So they have these huge eyes, and so they can't, it's not like they're the same as us where you can like close your iris down and have a smaller amount of light coming in. So they've had to adapt in a different way, which is really quite impressive, I think, being able to be able to see in the darkness of the ocean and in the brilliance of the sea ice is something else. Another thing is hearing, right? So on land, they've got a similar hearing range to us. But it's interesting because they don't have any pinnae, right? So like you and I, we have an external, we have the conch horn in order to pull the sound in, but they don't. And actually, they actually have a lot of earwax build up. So it's almost like natural earplugs so that the water doesn't flow in. And they're capable of hearing 60,000 hertz. So that's ultrasonic. That's far beyond. We max out somewhere around 20,000. They can hear better than cats and dogs. They have a very, very good sense of sound, and they can actually be able to do directional sound. So each ear, right, if they hear something, they can locate where that's coming from when they're swimming. It's very important. And again, another sign of still being a mammal is their sense of smell, right? So having come from land, they retain that sense of smell. And it's one of the ways that harp seals identify their pups on land is by smell. And then the cool thing is that their noses are designed so they can actually close their nostrils when they swim. So they lock that down. So it's just for when they're above air that they need to keep track of that. And they also have the very sensitive whiskers. Not quite the same sensitivity because they're not always benthic feeders, but they do have a higher ability than us. Now their pups, also obscenely cute, are somewhere around 20-25 pounds when they're born, and they are born also with a bit of blubber because they don't nurse for as long. So there's that balance again in many ways. I keep talking about balance, but it's really about energy conservation when you live someplace that's so harsh. So they're only going to nurse for around 12 days, and they're going to stop nursing when they get up to 80-ish pounds. So essentially, if you sort of do the math, give or take, they're gaining around 5 pounds a day, which the opposite of most diets when we think about it that way. And so when they lose their white coat, they get the name, their nickname that they have is called beaters, for when they get that gray silver pelt. And some of you may have guessed the reason why they have the beater nickname. So the harp seal is the species of seal that we often think about when you think about seal hunters. On the Atlantic coast of Canada, commercial hunting from European descendants or settlers has been a thing since around the 1700s. And it declined in the 1960s because of pushback from the general population. And so it's changed quite a bit. It still does happen today. It's very regulated. And so it's an interesting example of resource extraction, essentially taken too far, certainly. And the numbers have shown, so for example, like today's population is around 7.4 million, and that's been it's been steadily climbing since the 60s. In 1994, the government did a survey, and it was somewhere around 5 million. So they are recovering. They are recovering to a healthier population status, which I'm pretty happy to be able to say. All right, and our last seal, we have 2 more species left, but our last seal is the harbor seal. And this is probably one of the most common ones, and they have the widest distribution of range, which I'll show here in a second. But so again, they're in that 5.5 foot length range, 260 pounds, pretty good size if you are a polar bear looking for a snack. Their population, so they're very widely distributed, but there's only around 500,000 of them. And they are capable of, this is the cool thing, they're capable of actually sleeping underwater. So they can take a nap for about 30 minutes before they have to come up to air, come up and breathe and wake up. So they'll go out for pretty long foraging trips, keeping that in mind. And they also like to hunt in the shallow, so they're gonna go for squid, they're gonna go for crustaceans, shellfish. And so their average depth as far as foraging is around 100 meters, so 300 feet, give or take. But there's records of them going as deep as 500 meters. So think about that as like 15,500 feet, give or take a bit. So, right, it's the same as when we think about our Olympic athletes. Not everyone can run, the 100 meters in a super short time, but there's exceptions, right? And so it's very cool to see what they're capable of. Small aside, but this is something that again, coming back to that marine mammals class I took a long time ago when I used to live out on the Atlantic coast. I think this is such a cool coincidence, having worked both with bears and, working with bears and having to identify them. You identify the difference between a gray seal and a harbor seal the exact same way you identify between a brown bear and a black bear. Essentially, it's a really good example that like identifying by color is not a good indicator. Black bears can be brown, blonde, you name it. Grizzlies can be quite dark. And you really have to look at their morphology in order to identify their species. And so with the harbor seal, you have more of the dish nose, same as the grizzly bear. And with the gray seal, you have the long horse nose, as we call it, same as the black bear. So it's a 2 for the price of 1. The same trick can help you identify the difference between 4 different species. All right, I saved the biggest for last. I won't say the best, but I will certainly say the biggest. But of course, walruses are so cool. So they come from the Latin name Odobenus romarius, or rosmaris, which I normally don't delve into Latin, but this one is too funny not to share with you all. It translates into the tooth-walking seahorse. The tooth-walking seahorse. Sorry, I needed to say that twice. I just think it's so funny. There are around 250,000 of them currently living in the Arctic. They're the only species within their family left. So past pinnipeds that have since died off, there used to be more in this family, but now the only one that's left is the walrus. And it's important to remember that both species have tusks, or excuse me, both sexes have tusks, males and females. And they have some few interesting adaptations, right? So they have very, very thick, very tough skin. It's the thickest around the neck, likely due to competition when they're fighting with one another with their tusks, but also when they're feeding on the ocean floor. So they're coming up. There's a lot of friction, right, as they're sort of digging around in there, and so they need to have thick skin to protect themselves. And that's like a couple inches thick. It's quite intense. And they, if you think about their size, they actually eat organisms quite low on the food chain, right? So they're going for clams, bivalves, oysters, in that category of things. And when they dive down, they'll usually so their dive time is around 24 minutes, 20-25 minutes. But then when they go down, they're actually capable of eating about 40 to 60 clams in a single dive. So when you go out for oysters, imagine how much it would cost if you had to wine and dine a walrus. Couldn't resist the Alice in Wonderland slide out of that. And so as an adult, right, so they're eating quite a bit. So in a day, they need to eat around 25 kilograms, so 50 to 70 pounds in a day in order to maintain themselves as an adult, which is quite a lot on an individual scale, right? So they're going down, they're diving multiple times in a day and consuming all those, and then they're going to lay on the beach and digest. There are some walruses that also eat seals as well, and those would be more specialized depending on the region that they're in. Now, the way that they eat is quite fascinating. So this is an image of a walrus that is kept in a zoo, but it's a really good chance to see their mouth, which is quite something else. So they eat their food whole, and they actually use their whiskers, which can move independently. So think about each one of those whiskers like an octopus tentacle. They're capable of moving independently as well as together, but to bring, so let's say, so they're scouring along the bottom, they come across a clam, they'll use their whiskers, essentially like little fingers, to turn the clam so that the foot is in their direction of their mouth, and then they use their mouth like a big suction, and they blast all this water and then suck in all the soft parts, which I think is quite impressive, right? Because they don't have the tactile, like they're not like a raccoon where you can handle their food, right? But they're doing it all with their whiskers in their mouth, which I think is quite impressive. Now, this is, I think, an image that maybe comes to mind for a lot of us when we think about walruses, is all of them laying on the beach, sun soaking. They like to pile up and conserve heat, and in general, the males and females will stay apart for most of the year, but then when breeding time comes around, then they'll come together. And one thing I think is cool is that they often like to lie upside down, because like the seals, they have a lot of earwax, and they like to lay upside down in the heat to let some of that earwax drain out. I think is sort of a fascinating aside to their hauling out. And when they do haul out, they're using those tusks, right? So if they're on ice, they'll use them as almost like a snow hook. So they'll hook in, pull themselves up a little bit, and then hook in again. It's one of the ways to get themselves onto an ice float. Of course, those tusks are also used for display, for weapons during fighting, when males are competing, and as predator deterrence, right? So they will use those if polar bear, killer whales, something like that, so trying to get at them. Another part of their display is their vocalization. So they have a much wider range. They can sort of bark somewhat similar to a dog. They can actually make like a clanging sound. Like, you know, when you have the drummer and they hit the two things together, it's like, it sounds just like that. And it comes from way deep in their chest. It's really crazy. They can whistle as well. So very, very vocally diverse. I would say after this, if you wanted to go look at another YouTube sound, definitely go look up what a walrus sounds like. It's very, very cool. So these can weigh up to 4,000 pounds. That's how much an adult can weigh. So think about that. That's comparable to an SUV. That's how much power and force is behind one of these. And they're going to live 30, 40 years. So if you make friends with a walrus, you've got a friend for life. And they're going to sexually mature. So females sexually mature somewhere around 7, males also in that 7 to 10 range, but also keep in mind that they're polygamous and competitive, right? So even though they are capable of breeding at 7 to 10, most males aren't in the running to breed, let's say, until they're around 15. very cute. This doesn't happen all the time, but I couldn't resist throwing this in. So sometimes they will carry their calves on their back, the mothers will. So in pregnancy, female walruses are pregnant for around 15 months. When their calf is born, it's going to weigh 60 kilograms. So we're looking at 140, 150 pounds at birth. And they're going to stay with mom for a lot longer. So all the other species that we've talked about so far, they have these very short weaning periods, right? Less than a month in most cases, or on the outside of a month at the most. Whereas the calf will stay with the walrus with their mother for sometimes a year and a little bit more. And so it's part of the reason why females only have a calf every 3 years, part of that cycle. And so thinking about that, right? So there's much more long-term care, and the mothers in this scenario actually teach them to hunt, to forage. So the seal pups are essentially left to fend for themselves. They got to figure out life. A walrus calf learns from its mother, takes on some of those, so they'll learn to hunt the same way, right? So remember I briefly mentioned there are some walruses that hunt seals, so that would be something they would learn from their mother. And another thing to keep in mind, again, coming back to that energy balance story. So a walrus, their milk is much less high in fat. So theirs is only around 25%. So it's only about a quarter percentage fat compared to those. So they're not worried about getting them up to size and getting them self-sufficient on their own, because they're going to be around and they're going to take care of them a bit longer. So different strategies, right? Another cool thing about walruses is they're the only pinniped that nurses aquatically. So they can nurse in the water, whereas all the other species have to haul themselves out onto ice, onto land, in order to achieve that. And so distribution-wise, they really like to feed, they're benthic feeders, right? So I'm saying they're on the bottom, so they're gonna be near continental shelves. If as soon as the water gets too deep, there's no food for them, there's nothing for them to eat, right? And so they usually like to be in around that 80-meter depth. And so just to give a comparison here, right? So we've got the walrus distribution on the left, and this is the sea ice extent in the summer. I guess this one's a bit old, this is from 2012, but right? So thinking about our decline in sea ice, the sea ice is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And as it gets smaller and smaller, it's going into the center of that pole region where it's really deep. And so where it's really deep, that's not where all these species that we've just talked about today, that's not where they're feeding, right? They need to be where the food is, and the food is in those shallow regions. But if the ice isn't there, then there's nothing for them to haul out on. They can't nurse their pups, right? They have to travel way farther, they're burning more energy, and so they're losing access to their feeding grounds as the ice declines. And so this is probably the biggest challenge and the biggest unknown with climate change, right, is what is going to happen to the sea ice as it continues to decline. There's just going to be less availability, right? Less for everyone. And so with climate change and sea ice melting, we often think about that as the primary thing. It's just the surface area that's available to these species. But there are a lot of secondary effects as well that are going to happen because of this. And so one of the things is the opening up of shipping lanes in the Arctic. So I remember when I was still in school the first time, you know, we had this theoretical conversation, because so there were no Arctic shipping. There wasn't like active Arctic shipping until the 1990s, essentially in the summertime, because the ice floes open up, and then it's becoming more and more and more prevalent. And so thinking about some of these species, especially cetaceans, pinnipeds, right? They rely on sound so much to communicate. And the Arctic before now was a very, very quiet place, right? It's besides the sounds of ice breaking, besides the vocalizations themselves, it's a very quiet place. And now all of a sudden it's becoming this very active shipping route where they have to compete with that, right? Thinking about that bearded seal song, right? What happens when they can't hear each other? It's really going to change their distribution and how they communicate. The other thing is the actual shipping lanes themselves, right? So the traveling points, it's a huge efficiency. If you own a freight company, right, and you're hauling, it is way faster to ship things to cut through the Arctic than to go all the way down to the Panama Canal, for example, right? And so it makes sense that people would want to utilize this. But we've already identified that several of the shipping routes pass through really, really important pupping areas, right? And breaking up that ice, they already live in sea ice, which is an unstable substrate. They are already having to contend with all these things, and now you're going to start literally breaking apart their habitat, right? So it's a tricky thing to navigate, essentially. And also with shipping, another thing that comes is more invasive species, right? So thinking about, it doesn't take much, especially as things get warmer and the ice melts. Before, the ice kept out a lot of different species, whereas now a lot of species are moving north and competing. Either they're coming in on bulkhead water or they're just coming north all on their own, right? And so they're competing with the local Arctic species now, which, they used to have this niche occupation because they're the only ones that could live there. But with the ice being gone, they no longer have the sole title to that. Another thing, I apologize, this is a bit graphic. I meant to give a bit of warning. I won't spend too long here. But they are also being able to find now microplastics in the stomachs of seals, right? So all of these problems are making their way north. And there's something to being conscious of these things that are happening in our Arctic environment, as well as thinking about what it is, the role that we play in that, right? So a lot of us don't live in the Arctic. A lot of us, that's not where we call our home, but we're having a huge effect on this. And think back to that very first slide, right? The Arctic is where all of our biological productivity is. And so when we start to change that, we're going to change a lot of things in the world. And so I think it really deserves some conscious thought and changes as to how we move forward, which is part of the reason why I really love this slide. I'm thankful for Pinnipeds. And I'm thankful that I got to share them with you. And as my last thing that I want to share is actually one of the Inuit creation stories. So we're getting close to the hour, so I will make an abridged version of this. And so before I tell the story, though, I think it's really important to remember the context with which these stories exist, right? So every culture's stories reflects their values. They reflect the lives they lead, the challenges they face. It reflects their reality. And so I'm gonna reflect a little bit at the end, but we'll begin the story, and just keep that thought in your mind as I tell it. So there once was a girl in the village of Pinla, and she did not want to marry. Her father decided, after she time and time again refused to get married, that she would then marry Dog. Now, every night the dog would come to the village and he would transform himself into a man. And over time, he married the girl and took her off to their own island. However, the dog was not the best hunter, and so they still depended on her father for food. So that meant that every day, Dog would transform himself from man back into a dog, swim from the island they lived on, get food from the father, and then return back to his new wife. Time went by, they started a family, and one day when he was swimming across back to the island where she was from, another boat came, and there was a man in that boat, and he looked like a very strong, very successful hunter, and he asked her to come with him, excuse me. And she decided to leave. So she left her family and she left her children, and while Dog was away, she got in the boat with this other man and traveled to the island. And as she was traveling and they reached the other island, she realized that he wasn't what he thought she was. He wasn't a very big hunter. He was sitting on a seat, and it made him look bigger. And as they reached closer and closer to the island, he started to change, and he became not a man, but rather a seabird. He was a gull. And then she regretted her choice, where she realized that he was not a hunter, not the hunter she thought he was. And so she was forced to live in this village. So Dog returns, and he looks for weeks, and his wife doesn't return. And so he goes back and admits to her father that dog can't find her. And so the father tells the dog to stay and that he will go and find his daughter. And so the man paddles for weeks and eventually comes across the village, and he sees his daughter's jacket outside one of the huts. And he calls to the daughter, and the daughter comes running and jumps into the kayak with her father, and he goes to paddle her away and bring her home. And the gull, the second husband, realizes that his wife has gone missing and goes and chases after them, and he's not able to catch them. And so as a man, he's paddling. And so he returns as a gull and circles them time and time again. And he calls to her, asking her to come back. And she doesn't answer. She never responds. And all of a sudden he stops circling her and he leaves. But just as he leaves, the oceans begin to rise and the waves begin to roar. And the father fears that they're going to capsize. And he fears that there's too much weight on the kayak. And so he tells his daughter that she has to jump into the water, and he wants to save himself. And she refuses to leave the kayak. And so he pushes her from the kayak. And she still holds on as tight as she can. And the seas get more and more and more heavy, more violent. And fearing that they'll both die, he takes his hatchet and he chops at her fingers. And he cuts off the fingers at the first joint. And those fingers fall into the ocean and they become the whales. And still she holds on. She refuses to let go. And so he takes his hatchet again and he chops at the second fingers, at the second joint. And those fall into the ocean and they become the seals, the walrus, the pinnipeds. And he goes to strike at her one more time, for still she refuses to let go. And this time he ends up hitting her in the eye, knocks out her left eye. And with that, she lets go and she sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And the man reaches home and he tells the dog what's happened. And the man then sets up his tent and his kayak and he sets it up on the edge of the sea. And he lays in it. And that night the seas rise higher than they ever have before. And the man sleeps in his tent right in there. And the water goes up and rises above him. And in the morning, when the water goes down, the man is gone. And so is his tent. And that's the story of how the girl became Sedna, the woman underneath the water. And she is the mother of all marine mammals. And she is the reason that the Inuit respect and obey all of the taboos. That's what the word translates into English, is taboos. We might call them traditions or rituals if you prefer. Because she lives underneath and she has to be respected because she was dealt with so harshly and her punishment was so severe for her choosing to leave that's how she deals with the world. She has very little mercy. And so it is a heavy story. It's quite graphic. It's not our Robin Hood, Beauty and the Beast story. It's not like, but think about the world that they live in. It's very harsh up there. And so it reflects that really harsh environment that they grew up in and that they had to develop in, right? And so the respect for the environment comes from this solid place of that it is this, you have to pay, everything has to be paid for. It's that balance that I come back to, right? And so it's, I think it's part of the reason why I'm in love with the Arctic, certainly. It's a very harsh place. It is very demanding. And in order to live there, it's all or nothing, which I have come to really love and appreciate through the years. So thank you everyone for staying with me through the story and through the presentation. And I apologize, I've gone a bit past the hour, but I will pass it back to Sunny.
Thank you so much, Kristina. That was fascinating. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the questions field in your control panel. We actually already have lots and lots of questions for you today. So let me just go ahead and start. Is there an evolutionary connection between walrus and elephant tusks that you're aware of?
So we can, let's call this a coevolution. So thinking about it as there's not, like if you go far enough back, then yes, we're essentially all developing from the same general groups of animals that have survived different die-offs and things like that. But essentially, it's two different animals developing the same solution, right? Like you have a problem or you have something you need to overcome, and it develops the same way. What's another example of this? There's a really cool one with pheromones and tracking. So like jaguars and bears have developed the same sort of tracking pheromones, right? But it came from completely different ways. If you look at the genetics of the way it developed, this one developed, through this route of DNA, and then this, right? So essentially, it's like nature sort of picks away at the best way to solve it, and they've both come up with this like expanding. You already have invested in energy into growing your teeth, and then just invest into a couple more, which is a sort of simplistic way of looking at it, but it's a cool example of coevolution.
Very cool. Switching topics, are you aware of any Arctic nations regulating shipping routes to minimize adverse impacts on wildlife? Any international conventions?
Yeah, so this is an ongoing thing between all of the Nordic countries, as far as signing, because this is a changing thing, right? When I was first in school learning about this, remember we talked about it was going to be 2025. That was going to be the year that it was going to be ice free and that it was going to open up. And so as things have been opening, each country has been trying to establish how they're going to act about that and what they're going to enforce. So for example, like Canada has what's the official title? It's essentially the last marine reserve, but that's not what it's called. I'm forgetting the proper name. But basically, they've done a bunch of models of the sea ice to figure out where is its last going to be retained, and that's already a marine protected area, so that like there's not supposed to be shipping through there. There's not supposed to be all these things through that area as things start to change. So yes, the policies are in place. I will say, however, and this is something that I mildly pessimistic, I admit, but so the policies have been in place. Now what I want to see from the governments is them to actually enforce them, because enforcement is not the same thing as signing the piece of paper. So everyone is, as these things start to change, a lot of the countries have signed that paper, but we're going to see in the next 5 to 7 years who's actually going to stand by that. So it's good to sort of be aware of that and keep the pressure on that of no, like stand by what they said they would do.
Excellent. So here is a question specific to, I believe, the polar bear trips, but I guess it could be the summer trip to Churchill as well. Will we see as many seals as polar bears up in Churchill?
No. So just in general, usually when I go, I probably only see 3 or 4 in a whole season. So you don't see them very often, and that's a couple of reasons. One, because the polar bears are there because the sea ice hasn't formed yet, and so if the sea ice isn't there, the seals aren't there, and so you have that dynamic. And then if you're there later on, like usually if you end up seeing seals, it's because you have a trip closer to like the end of November and the ice is starting to come in, and you'll see them haul out, which is always so fascinating because we're in these high up rovers, right? You're 15, 17 feet in the air. And so you can see the seal on the ice and you're looking at the polar bear and you're like, buddy, like a snack is right there and you can't even, and they never, and you, anyways, it's sort of funny. But so yeah, they're not super common. You see way more polar bears than seals, which is one of the few places in the world where you get to say that.
Here's a fun one. Do pinnipeds echolocate?
They do not. So they don't have the, what's the proper way to say this? Like whales, porpoises are whales, but cetaceans, they actually have an organ. So they have a centralized focus of blubber that then the sound comes back to and then is like neurologically translated. So pinnipeds don't have that, right? So they're able to hear very, very well, but they're not sending out a sound and then waiting for the information to come back.
Got it. Okay. When a harbor seal sleeps underwater, is it sleeping on a ledge, on the ground, or can they just sleep by floating? Do they have an eye open while sleeping? Can you tell us more about how harbor seals sleep?
Yeah, so effort-wise, they actually don't have zero buoyancy. So I don't know how much of their, like partially they'll be able to sleep partially like a sea otter, right? So sea otters will sleep like on the surface. That's one way. But I don't know how much of their brain entirely shuts down. So they won't, they'll probably sleep with their eyes closed, and they can actually kind of go under. But what they'll do is they will, because they're holding their breath, right? But they have their own internal amount of oxygen. And so think about it more of like yoga meditation, right? So when it's not true sleep, but you've shut down a lot of things and you're just sort of in a stasis. So that's what they're able to achieve. So that's going to be, even if they go under the water, like they're not breathing, but they're just sort of suspended in the water column, and they're able to just like rest, and then they'll come back up, take that breath, and continue onwards.
Excellent. Well, that's the last question we have time for today. So I will hand it back to you for any closing comments.
Lovely. Well, yes, thank you, Sunny. Thank you, everyone, for coming down this Pinniped journey with me. I realized the other day why I've decided to do this topic. I guess a couple months ago, my roommate got a new job as one of the Parks Canada. So he does a lot of marine work on the island here, and he changed his phone to a seal bark. And I've been listening to a seal bark for 2 months now. And so when I got to pick this next topic, I was like, oh, I need to do seals, obviously. And I only just realized today that I've been subconsciously driven to share pinnipeds. So thank you, everyone, for going down the rabbit hole with me. It was very fun to delve into some of this, and I hope you all learned a lot and have a new appreciation for some of our Arctic marine mammals.
Well, thanks again, Kristina, for taking the time to present for us today. I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye.